Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Nutritional Revolution podcast. We have Keely Henninger here with us today. Silent G there. I wanted to say the G. She is a professional trail runner and was a member of Team USA, holding the USA 50-mile national champion title. And she's a scientist with her honors degree in biology and neuroscience, conducting research on female athlete health, nutrition needs, performance, and relative energy deficiency in sport. All things we love talking about, learning about. So thank you so much for joining us today, Keely.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to have a chat with you guys.
So as most of our guests know and listeners, we do two truths and a lie. So before people learn too much about you, we will start right off the bat with that. So share your two truths and a lie with us.
Okay, so first one is that last year I ski toured off the top of Mount Hood.
Okay.
The second one is that I have a running dog that is cross-eyed.
Oh, cool.
And the third one is I was a 1,000-point scorer in my high school basketball team.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So Nia and I are going to guess, but don't tell us the answer. We'll reveal it at the end. I have known dogs that have been cross-eyed, so I feel like that could absolutely be true. Ski touring off Mount Hood, I was not a great basketball player, so part of me wants to think that the 1,000 points might be the lie, but and if not, that's pretty incredible. So I'm going to go with the number 3. What do you think, Nia?
I was also going to go with number 3 because I'm awful at basketball. So for the same reason.
Okay. We might learn the answer to that as we go and learn more about Keely, but why don't we dive into Keely? How did you get into, or what interested you in biology and neuroscience and then going into the field of research?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, since I was a little girl, I wanted to be a physician. So I feel like I was kind of pushed into the path of like biology or some sort of applied science. And so, I kind of chose biology neuroscience because going into undergrad, I was under the impression that the most prestigious field in medicine was being a neurosurgeon. And I wasn't kind of guided in a way that would have gotten me to med school in a very healthy way. And luckily, I kind of backed off the med school dreams for a little bit while I was figuring out my ways after school and taking on running and stuff. But I actually found sports science and applied exercise physiology after my undergrad. So I didn't even know you could major in, exercise science or biomechanics or anything like that. And so I moved to Colorado to start running and was introduced to Dr. Roger Crom, who is like one of the OGs of biomechanics and applied biomechanics, and got to do a study with him studying the energetics associated with running and hiking uphill.
Cool.
And I thought that was really, really cool, and ended up getting a job with Nike doing kind of like applied science and engineering initially. So I was looking at a lot of things like, running, pacing algorithms and different algorithms to kind of build coaching plans off of.
Cool.
So it's kind of like applying things to, my runner self and also kind of getting a little bit of science. But I definitely missed working with people. And like at my core, I knew I would still go back towards medicine eventually. I love working with people so much. So I actually started doing some like internships in applied physiology at Nike, doing some of the work with the 4% shoe and running economy, and then ended up working in the research lab there as an applied physiologist for a little over 4 years, studying everything from applied breast biomechanics. So how breast movement for women impacts, everything from VO2 max to running economy and running mechanics.
Wow.
Which was really interesting. I never thought I'd be an expert in breasts and sports bras, but I did that for a solid 2 years, and it was really, really interesting. And you meet a lot of women, and a lot of women are very passionate about sports bras. And then I luckily got to kind of dabble in everything. I did some longitudinal studies in injury. And then my final year there, I got to do a full year on hormones and how hormones impact training and how they impact like apparel preferences and how those hormones may change across the cycle and how those changes might impact things like running economy and stuff like that. And so I got to kind of dabble in a lot of things, but at my core, I still really wanted to go back and pursue medicine. And so I ended up leaving that job about a year ago and getting ready to go back to med school, I took on kind of like a side project with a PhD up in Washington. And right now we're doing a bunch of studies around relative energy deficiency in females related to trail running nutrition, kind of like carbohydrate intake, and then how that is related to things like disordered eating, exercise dependence, and training volume. And I do that with Dr. Kelly Pritchett, who is like kind of a pro in that space. So she's done a ton of research in that realm. And so it's been really cool to work alongside her, because like my expertise is not in nutrition, but working with her to kind of apply the different avenues of physiology, nutrition, and all of those things together has been really fun.
That's a very cool background. And all the different, who knew, like, just all the different research with even sports bra stuff. I mean, it's pretty, really fascinating. You mentioned hormones. I know this wasn't our talking points, but it's got me thinking the hormones in relation, fluctuating through the cycle. And were you saying that it could alter one's decision in the type of clothing or like sports bra they're choosing? Wow.
Yeah. I obviously can't go into crazy detail, but yeah, we found that during the cycle, there were different preferences for different types of sports bras and different types of, thermoregulatory apparel. And so, thinking about it critically, that doesn't shock me too much, because you do have pretty big swings in body core temperature during the phases of your cycle. And one thing that I've noticed that I do that was also seen was that, like, during the phase where you are really high hormone, where your body temp is elevated, you feel cold like normal during the day, but you heat up a lot hotter. And so I tend to overdress and get a lot hotter during my runs than like maybe during the lower hormone phase. And that was like relatively consistent with some athletes where they were choosing to wear a lot heavier clothing during those phases, but like then would rate them afterwards as being too hot.
Interesting.
Yeah,
that is very interesting. And you mentioned some stuff with shoes as well, kind of engineering of the shoe and efficiency, I think, with running, right?
Yeah, so that's like around, one of the first projects I did was the 4%. So the Nike 4% shoe that basically improved running economy 4%. We did all those testings in-house as well as outsource them. So, we've done tests on every single prototype of the 4% to 5% to 6% shoe. So all of those were super cool. And then, trying to tie in running economy to like things like breast motion or hormonal phase, obviously a lot more sticky and hairy, but like also very interesting and very individualized.
Yeah, definitely. Wow. Yeah, that is very interesting. And what a neat background to have it kind of going into the research that you're going into now too. Did you find you applied a lot of the stuff you were learning to your own running at all, or?
Totally. I think, getting to see some of Kipchoge's training, and how like purposeful a lot of it was, had me questioning a lot of my, like easy runs. Are they easy enough? Are they too long? Was hitting this arbitrary mileage number while working a 9 to 5, like, was it necessary? So I was just seeing a lot more like purposeful training where all the runs had a purpose instead of, filling your mileage calendar with just a bunch of junk. And I think that actually helped me a lot, because when you do work full time, it's really hard to hold high mileage. Heck, I'm now basically full time running, and I still think it's hard to hold high mileage. So
wow.
That, and then a lot with the menstrual cycle. I'd say I never really cared about mine for the first like 3 or 4 years of my career. I actually kind of loved that I didn't have it for most of it. Even though that was like a different underlying issue. I would say as I started to get more interested in training and then female hormones, I definitely started to track my own and pay more attention to how mine impacted my training, and then kind of do that with some people that I help with coaching as well.
That's awesome. That is, I think, we're seeing more and more research in that area, which is just, it's always fascinating to see. So, but the individual piece seems to just reiterate itself through the papers. So with the research you're doing now, tell us, if you can tell us a little bit about that. I know you said it's ultra runners and red S. Have you guys started the study yet, or are you assessing any data yet?
So we set the study out like last June. So we got all the responses back end of summer. And so we're actually submitting our first paper for journal review like this week. So yeah, we might have to have me and Dr. Pritchett back to talk about all the studies in really high detail, but like, yeah, I can totally tease it right now. So we conducted a survey that we ended up getting over 3,000 responses to, which is
Wow.
amazing for a
Yeah.
survey.
Yeah.
And the first paper is just focusing on the respondents aged 18 to 40. And that was still 2,200. So we ended up getting like over 1,000 of masters athletes, and then over 2,000 of normal or just like, you know, non-masters athletes, even though most 40-year-olds are absolute crushers. So I don't know why that's the threshold, but that's where all the surveys or the, you know, clinical scales kind of end at 40 for women, because they don't want to deal with those hormonal fluctuations. But the first survey, the survey in general basically looked to study fueling habits. So how many carbohydrates per hour is consumed during like training runs and races of different lengths. So we chose kind of the ACSM standardized distances. So it'd be like under 2.5 hours and greater than 2.5 hours, and utilize those carbohydrate recommendations to kind of bucket everyone into, you know, if they're meeting them or not. And then we wanted to compare those results to things like low energy availability based off the LEAF Q, disordered eating based off the DESA-6, and exercise dependence based off the exercise dependence scale. And just see if there was like this nice coalition of those four facets. Because I mean, if you've been in sport for as long as I have, like everyone I meet is displaying at least two of those four things. So it's like, and for me, like, and for Kelly, we work a lot with ultra endurance athletes, and you know, fueling in our sport is even more important than fueling in other sports. And so because the prevalence of low energy availability and disordered eating is relatively high for the most part in endurance athletes, we wanted to see if there was any correlation to fueling practices. And then if there were, to be able to take that data and at least like use it to start discussions with other research units and also like other fueling nutrition companies to be like, hey, you know, your gel says to eat 1 an hour, and that's not even close to the fueling recommendation. And like a lot of people aren't fueling properly, and it is showing correlation to these detrimental health impacts. So like maybe we change our marketing, or maybe we do a little bit of a showcase of how important fueling is. So we're giving that knowledge to the actual consumer instead of just, you know, putting something on there, hoping them to do their own research and know how to fuel. That's just unrealistic, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really fascinating and will be really informative. With the questionnaire at all, out of curiosity, were there any questions regarding like why someone might not be eating more due to GI issues or fear of GI issues or that kind of stuff?
Yep. So we did cover, if you chose to not consume carbohydrates, what were some of those most common reasons you didn't choose? We had some questions that are going to be in a different paper looking more at mental side of fueling. So it was like, do you choose to fuel on your easy days? Do you purposefully cut calories to like change your body mass? Do you follow a specific diet? Do you cut out certain foods? Like those kind of things were part of it as well. It was a very massive survey, but obviously those things are all just, they made the story too complicated. And so they'll be kind of like paper number 3.
Gotcha. Yeah. I'm excited. For you guys. That's going to be
fun. It's data. Definitely though, like a reminder of the vigors of getting publications ready for journals, because it's very different than Nike, because at Nike, only the people at a really, really high level can publish. And so like, you know, I wasn't there for that long and I was never able to publish. And that's 6.5 years of not publishing, you know, where I'd kind of forgotten how nuanced it was from my earlier days. And so it's been a good reminder that like, wow, this takes a while.
Yeah. Well, kudos to you guys for putting in the work on that. That's going to give the world some really good information, I'm sure, for the ultra running community. So kind of with this research field, you mentioned you had not had a cycle for a period of time, but did you ever struggle with like fueling, or like what were some of the woes you went through as you kind of progressed in your running career?
Yeah, so I'd say I started off probably, you know, telltale signs of all things around body dissatisfaction and disordered eating thoughts. I started running and this might give no, I won't say anything. I started running after I dislocated both shoulders playing basketball.
Oh,
And so I wasn't able to play basketball in college. And so I started running because I just didn't have anything else to do. And so I was so used to having a sport all the time that, you know, I just picked up running, literally just the same 4-mile loop every day. But it's such a different sport than playing basketball and soccer full time that like your body changes really quickly, especially when you're 17, 18, right? So I kind of got obsessed with like the comments that you would get from someone who'd be like, wow, you're way too thin now. And I'd be like, okay, cool. This is something I can control. Like I couldn't control my shoulders. I can control this. So I kind of went down a pretty poor slope, because also at that time, you know, I went to university, and a lot of the girls there running cross country or running club cross country were advocating for the loss of the menstrual cycle and just like really crushing your training. And so it was a very skewed mentality that only fed my, you know, desire to train harder, because I'm like, oh, well, I still get my period, so maybe I have to train harder so that I don't get it, to be more like those girls. And so, yeah, for like all through college, I feel like I definitely battled ups and downs with the fueling exercise balance, where, you know, I was kind of all over the place. And I would say it slowly got better for the next 4 years of my running career, but still was just never right. You know, I still was purposefully under fueling and purposefully making the runs harder, even though, you know, trail running, ultra running, already hard enough. We don't need to make it harder. And I'd say like, it took some like nasty blood tests where I was like, wow, I am really unhealthy, and some pretty frank conversations with my physician to start to discuss stuff with a nutritionist, start to implement new things, slowly start to change. But again, like it doesn't happen that quickly. And for me, unfortunately, like I was changing my fueling, I think in a very positive way, but I still was running a lot. And I think just from 5 to 6 years of no menstrual cycle and poorly treating my body, like my bones were just not super stoked. And so I got a huge big bone stress fracture in 2019, beginning of 2019. And kind of, I'd say I was trending to start doing changes. I think that really accelerated them. But I was talking to Lauren Fleshman the other day. We luckily got her on our podcast to interview her about her book. And she said something along the lines of like, I want to be the person that says my journey was really linear out of that hole, but like it wasn't. And neither was mine. It's like, you get the writing on the wall, you have this giant big bone stress fracture. And I feel like you take some steps forward, but then it's so easy to find yourself 2 steps backward all of a sudden. And you're like, how did I get here? And so I feel like I'm pretty close to being on 100% out of that journey, but it's still like, you always have to keep yourself in check and kind of reevaluate your relationship with running and fueling, and be aware that, you know, there are little triggers that can happen, whether it's an injury or a poor race or something that can kind of, you know, bring back those feelings of like needing of control or something like that.
Yeah. Did you seek out like any help from like a therapist or psychologist or anything like that?
I didn't know. I feel like I grew up in a culture where therapy was like kind of chastised. And so I never really sought it. I think you kind of like to think you're still in control, even though you're completely out of control. I mean, now I see a therapist now that I feel like I'm more, you know, okay with seeing one, and maybe more confident in how good it's for me, and also confident in myself. So I'm not as like ashamed of going. But no, I didn't. And I really wish that I would have been in a mental state to be able to seek one, but I don't think I was.
Yeah. I think maybe too, I mean, from my own personal experience, going into a field of science is like when there's something going on with the body, maybe you did this too, is like, you just like start hitting PubMed and doing like all the research and trying to find like that thing to do it yourself kind of.
Oh, totally. And I think you can even totally trick yourself, right, into thinking you're fine. Like, I think it took couple blood tests and a frank conversation with some nutritionists and doctors for me to actually like own up to what was going on. Otherwise it's easy to just keep pushing it aside, right? You're young, you're resilient. If you feel like crap, but you're fine, you know? And so it's really easy to just ignore it, even though the writing's on the wall.
So some of the symptoms you noticed that kind of caused you to take action, you had your fracture, there was a loss of menstrual cycle, you said you felt like crap. Was there anything else that you noticed going on? or maybe the listeners should pay attention to that they might be experiencing?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I would wake up 95% of the time and feel awful and not want to go run.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I think that's okay if you feel that way once a week,
Mhm.
maybe once every other week. Because
Yeah.
like sometimes you just wake up, you don't want to go run. It's cold, it's raining, whatever. That's normal.
Yeah.
If you wake up almost every day and you feel like you need to go back to sleep for an entire day and
Yeah.
you don't want to run, like that's your body telling you like you're doing a little bit too much. And I would also be just really irritable and not prioritize seeing other people. I think
Mm.
like I was just unwilling to stop thinking about myself.
Mhm.
So everything was very internalized, and like that kind of stress just made me not have the capacity to like be as engaged with other people or like have the capacity to go do those kind of things.
Yeah.
And so noticing yourself like withdrawal almost, and that I feel like looking back was a big sign for me because I love people. I love interacting with people. And so
Yeah.
the fact that you're like living like a little hermit for a while because you're just so stressed and just all consumed by these thoughts of yourself, and
Mhm.
it's not a good thing. And
Yeah.
then I'd say also the final thing I noticed was, well, this was kind of like a blood test thing, but also something that I may or may not have like freaked myself out for. But I noticed in my blood test that like my thyroid was really low,
Mm.
my cortisol was super high, and then my glucose was really high. And so
Mm.
my body was just like not functioning well.
Mhm.
And so for a while I thought I had hypothyroidism, then I thought I was going to be diabetic. Like my doctor was all over the place. They had no clue what's going on. And
Shoot.
so I feel like my body just wasn't feeling functionally normal. Like I would have something that had sugar in it, and sometimes I'd feel fine and sometimes I would feel so wonky.
Oh,
It was like
wow.
just a bunch of ups and downs, and I
Yeah.
think that's just from chronic like overtraining and high cortisol, right? Like your
Yeah.
body's just like, what is going on?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Wow.
it was just not that pleasant, but you
Yeah.
don't notice until you're out of it.
Right.
And so now I feel like if I have a day or two of like really high stress, I'll feel that, a very glimpse of like feeling that way. And I'll be
Mhm.
like, oh my gosh, I lived like this for years. Like I'm fine. This is a
Yeah.
day. Like
Yeah.
let's just chill for a little bit. But it's like it's horrible. You're like, wow, I lived a lot of my life that way, and that is really sad.
Yeah. Shoot. Yeah. I totally recognize what you're saying too. When there's that situation where you think you're okay and you don't realize how maybe like bad you're feeling until you get out of that situation. And
Exactly.
yeah, I had a client, and we did her labs, and her ferritin was at a 7, which is very low for our listeners. And she's like, I feel great. I'm like, really?
Oof, yeah.
Like,
You're like,
how
well,
in the
how about you
world?
feel? How would you feel if your ferritin was a 30?
Yeah, exactly.
Which
I'm
isn't
like,
even that good, but at least
right.
it's yeah, my
So,
ferritin also never would go above 12 or 11. And
wow.
I was like adamantly vegan for not
Mhm.
great reasons. And
Yeah.
so again, when I had those consistent bad blood tests and I just felt like crap all the time, I finally like started eating meat again, which I don't
Mm.
advocate everyone has to go eat meat. I don't think
Yeah.
that's the case, but I think that's works for me.
Hmm.
But my ferritin after that for like 6 months went from always 11 or 12, regardless of how much iron I took, to like 45 or 50. I can't remember which number.
Yeah.
And I felt amazing.
Yeah. It is interesting. I've seen that with a handful of clients. The supplemental iron just
Mm-hmm.
doesn't move the needle.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough. So
Mm-hmm. It's also
yeah.
like I feel like me and Kelly had this talk the other day. It would be a really hard study to conduct, but if you have any ideas, feel free to throw them out there.
Yeah.
It would be really cool to see how, different energy states as well
Mm.
as different exercise regimens paired with like fueling and timing impact iron absorption.
Yeah.
Because I
Yeah.
feel like we kind of know the response of like hepcidin on it, but we don't
Hmm.
really know how chronically low energy availability would impact it,
Right.
and all of these other things that may or may not impact absorption. I think
Hmm.
that would be super interesting.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. Yeah, for our listeners, it's a molecule in the body, in the stomach, or absorption process through the digestive system that interferes with the absorption of iron and can be elevated from exercise. And from my understanding, I'm like picturing the graph from the PubMed article, it continues to increase over several hours post exercise. So that interference is significantly greater. I want to say for up to 6 hours post exercise, if I recall correctly. Which makes me think too, if it's elevated from a state of stress, to your point of checking in on different states of energy availability, if one is in a very low state of energy availability, thus inducing a state of stress, is there a possibility of potentially higher hepcidin? So that's a theory.
Yeah.
That would be interesting to see.
Yeah, and it's a liver derived hormone, so it will degrade like the ferritin transport. And so my question as well is like, after chronic ultra endurance exercise that may or may not require your liver to be kind of overworking, would that make it even worse, and for how long?
I love a good science brainstorm session. Yeah, so fascinating. So kind of back to your kind of journey through that progression, you mentioned kind of some of the like making some changes. What were those changes from an energy perspective? Did you like start swapping things in for other foods? Or I mean, you mentioned the meat, but and then fueling wise, were you changing anything there with your runs?
Yeah, so I'd say, first of all, in regards to everyday energy intake, so breakfast, lunch, dinner, whatever that may mean, I started making myself eat breakfast. I never used to have breakfast before running. So then most of the time what that would look like would be, you eat dinner at 6 or 7, you wake up and you run, and then I'm rushing to work, and the next thing you know, it's noon.
Yeah.
And you had ran 13, 14 miles and not had anything to eat.
Right.
So my first one was to just make a breakfast that I liked. For me, it was like overnight oats with protein, and just make myself eat it every single day, regardless if I ate it or if I ran at 6 or if I ran at 8. Like, it was just must have it before. It was just a way for me to make sure I did it.
Yeah.
And then always having like fats and proteins in lunch, and fats and more protein and more fats in dinner, because I realized I would just like grab whatever was easy. And typically when you're in that starvation state, your body is craving carbohydrates because it's in starvation mode. And that's probably not the best energy choice for you, because you burn them so quickly, and it almost like further exacerbates your hunger response, because you're just like, okay, now more. And it's not that highly caloric. And so for me, it was like really stressing more fats and proteins, more like smaller meals in the middle of the day, not just 3 meals. And then really emphasizing like more protein and fats with the carbohydrates at dinner as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And then the second part of that was definitely trying to increase fueling during long runs, because I think I used to pride myself on finishing a long run with the least amount of fuel possible. It was like this badge of honor to be like, oh my gosh, I did it. And while that's cool, it's not helpful to training. It's not helpful to, adaptation to training. Your body's not able to recover from those miles. And there's also the delayed impact on stress hormones after not fueling for that long.
Yeah.
So for me, it was like, okay, if I'm running for more than 2 hours, I'd better bring fuel with me. And it's now a goal of trying to like eat as much as I can, instead of like, how little can I eat to get done? It's like, how much can I eat to feel fine when I'm done?
Yeah.
And so that was kind of my mental shift. And again, it did not happen linearly. Those were just the goals that slowly started to become habits, and eventually now are like how I function, but it took a while.
Yeah. I think that's a great point there too. I mean, a lot of habit change takes slow changes and consistency over time, right? No, we don't expect somebody to overnight add an extra 60 grams of carbs per hour to their training session. That would probably deter them from fueling again in the future.
100%. But I have one athlete who was like, hey, I ran this time with 20 grams an hour. And I was like, cool. I bet we can get you to 35 to 40. And then maybe in a year you could get to 60. And like, what could you do then?
Right.
But like, starting somewhere that's achievable. It's like, okay, I'm used to 1 gel an hour. Can we make that 1.5? Can we make that 2? Not like, can we make that 3 or 4? That's a lot of a change. And like, their gut might not handle it.
Yeah.
So it's like, thinking about that. It's key. Yeah.
slow progressions. Yeah, I think
Mhm.
that's smart. With kind of the increased fueling during your sessions, was there any noticeable changes in like your daily energy after the run, like later in the day when you fueled properly before and during?
Oh yeah, totally. I'd say that typically my day was like relatively over once I finished a really long run if I didn't fuel,
Hmm.
because you're just like so out of it
Yeah.
afterwards. And I'd say now I can go about a normal day. Like I don't have
Awesome.
to be a zombie. I can be
Yeah.
done with my run, have a normal lunch, and feel pretty normal. Like
Yeah.
my legs aren't tired. Like runs where I fuel really, really well, I can run. Like I've ran some solid efforts where I've fueled at least 45 grams of carbs an hour, if not 60.
Hmm.
And I can run the next day. I don't have nearly as much muscle fatigue. I finish the run feeling like in high spirits. I don't hit as many loads during the run,
Yeah.
which is super common. I feel like everyone loves to be like, oh my God, Keely, you crushed that run. Like you won. You must have felt good the whole time. It's like, no. Even when you're fueling really well, you do have down
Yeah.
moments, like you're running forever. But
Right.
if you do fuel well, you have a lot less.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Do you have a fueling routine? Do you try and get something in you every 20 minutes, or what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I would say that's what I typically shoot for is like
Mm.
if I'm doing a relatively high intensity long race, so like 50K, 50 mile, where you're
Mm.
running pretty fast the whole
Hmm.
time, that's where I really try to do the 3 gels an hour, which would
Hmm.
be about one every 20.
Hmm.
If I'm doing something a little lower intensity, then it's closer to 2 an hour, maybe 2.5. So it'd be
Hmm.
like half a pack of goo chews or something on top of the
Hmm.
gels. But yeah, I always try to do at least like 20 minutes or every 30 minutes.
Hmm.
Where it gets a little tricky is if you like the liquid calories, which is what I normally do
Mm.
now this time of year when it's so cold, because I feel
Oh
like
yeah.
it's hard to kind of eat with your hands.
Yeah.
That's harder to monitor because you're like, okay, I know these bottles have this much, but how do you distribute that across the time? It's a little trickier.
Right.
So I still do try to have something concrete that it's easier to count. So you still
Yeah.
have something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think a timer, super easy. And then I used to be really proud of myself if I like didn't fuel the last hour, right? You're like, oh, I
Mm.
have an hour left, I'm fine. But if you read any of the papers in triathlon that talk about the like negative implications of fasting during
Mhm.
exercise, even the like fasting experiments where they wanted cyclists to quote unquote fast for some of their ride, none of the coaches advocated for fasting in the last like 2 hours. They were all like, no, no, 60 to 90 carbohydrates or grams of carbohydrates an hour in the last 2 hours, even if you fasted, quote unquote, for 20 grams to 40 grams in the first 4 hours,
Mm.
because
Mhm.
the negative impacts of like not fueling in those final hours, when your body needs that extra glycogen in those muscles to start repairing them when you're done. That shocked me and has now changed my whole like outlook on fueling, and lets me swallow my pride a little bit more when I'm getting close to the end of a run and like, oh, I don't need to fuel. I have 5 miles left. It's like, no, just have one more gel. It doesn't
Yeah,
matter.
that's awesome. What you mentioned liquid fuel. What's your go-to brand? We're not sponsored by anybody, so you can
Okay.
say.
I love Goo Roctane.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
60 grams or 80 grams per serving.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, it's pretty highly caloric, which is nice.
That's awesome. Have
Yeah.
you, out of curiosity, ever done any like sweat testing to figure out?
Mm-mm.
No, no.
No, I would love to. I
Yeah.
I was about to do it last year before Western States, but
Mm,
then I travel a lot around before it because I do a
yeah.
lot of training in different areas. It just didn't work out.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that would be really cool.
Yeah. The sweat world seems like it's just like blowing up. And we had, oh goodness, Nia, help me with the name.
Dr. Alan McCubbin.
Yes, we had Dr. Alan McCubbin on, and he was diving into a lot of the sweat testing tools and basically
Mhm.
saying that we can get the data, but we don't have any research to suggest now what to do with the information, basically, right? So it's like, it might tell you that you're
Mhm.
losing 1,000 milligrams of sodium over the hour, but we don't know
Mm.
how much
Mm.
actually needs to be replaced,
Exactly.
you
Yeah.
know?
Like how much, what is the minimum viable like dosage of
Yeah,
replacing that? Because like what can you even absorb? What is needed? Like, does your body actually lose? Yeah, it's a tough question because
it
it's like you
is.
just need it to maintain the balance
Yeah,
so that you don't have like hyponatremia or something. But
yeah.
yeah, how much is that is excess? And then how much salt do someone eat in their diet. That always impacts how much salt you'll sweat out.
Yeah.
Like that's always tricky because I think a lot of people like to pump salt tabs or like, electrolyte drinks the day or two before a big race.
Yeah.
But then they might see, or big runs even, they might see tons of sweat on themselves and be like, oh my gosh, I need to take like 5 salt tabs. When it's
Yeah.
like, well, no, you just were kind of overdosed on salt.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you might not need 5.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, it's tough.
I have had clients too where they'll go to like altitude and all of a sudden like see white on their kit when they didn't see it down at sea level. And it's like, well, the air's a lot drier up there.
Yep,
So,
exactly.
yeah.
Totally.
Very cool. So I definitely appreciate you sharing your journey with your experience and how you've evolved your nutrition and fueling. I think that's really helpful. And I think you also brought up a really great point that I just like to reiterate is like the continued fueling towards the end of your session. I think that's really important for our listeners to hear for that. Like you mentioned, the purposes of starting that recovery process. So don't stop fueling too early for our listeners. So what's kind of on, I know you mentioned the study, what's kind of next up for you personally with the racing, you mentioned med school study, kind of what's coming down the pipeline for you?
Yeah, I have a very busy winter, spring. So we're wrapping up our study. So we have a couple papers kind of in the works, and then we have the one we're submitting. And then I'm taking the MCAT at the end of March. So basically this next like 2-month section, I'm just basically studying.
Wow.
And then I'm racing Black Canyon 100K next. That is in mid-February, and that is a 100-kilometer race that goes from a place called Meyer in Arizona. It's about an hour and 45 minutes north of Phoenix and ends in Black Canyon City, which is about 45 minutes north of Phoenix.
Okay.
On really beautiful net downhill trail.
Oh, nice.
And it's a qualifier for Western States because it's a golden ticket race. So the top 2 men and women will get golden tickets to Western States, which is a guaranteed entry.
Nice.
So that is the A goal. The B goal would be to just have another like successful race under my belt and then try again maybe in a different race this year. Just because this last year I dropped out of Western States because I tore my ankle. So
oh shoot.
So it'll be good to have a nice like confidence booster, even if it's not a golden ticket, but that's the main goal. And then hopefully Western States. And then kind of go from there. Yeah.
That's great. And for our listeners, I think some of them likely know what Western States is, but for maybe our newbies to running, could you explain Western States and how all that works?
So Western States is a 100-mile trail race that originated from a horse route that went from the Tahoe area and ended in Auburn, California. So it's a point-to-point route that, was originated because people rode horses along it through California. And it's a beautiful point-to-point race. It net descends, so it's a scorcher on the quads because you're running a lot of downhill. And it's notoriously very hot because there's it starts in Tahoe at 9,000 or 6,000 feet, climbs up to 9,000 feet, but then it descends down into these canyons close to sea level, typically during the heat of the day, and it's in the end of June, so it's typically like in the 100 degrees Fahrenheit in those canyons. And the Western States 100 is like, I'd say like the Super Bowl of North America for trail running. It's probably the most prestigious race in the US, at least for trail runners. So it's a cool one. I don't think I am a big 100-mile race fan, but I definitely am a big Western States fan because I've ran it once now and most of it a second time. And I'm like, okay, I'm hooked to Western States. Don't know if I'm hooked to 100 miles. It's really far, but definitely enjoy Western States. Yeah.
How long does something like Western States take most people, or what's like, do you know the faster times versus kind of average?
I ran in the 19 hours, and I'd say the fastest women's time's a little bit under 17. And the fastest men's time's closer to 15.
Wow.
And so pretty quick. To break that down for the men's time, I think I calculated it. It's like pretty close to an 8-minute mile.
Wow.
Almost 20,000 feet of climbing. So it's a decent clip. The women's course record right now is closer to like a 10-minute mile for the whole thing, which is still pretty fast.
Yeah.
And then I think the average time, like you get a cool belt buckle for going sub 17, 24.
Okay. Yeah.
So Yeah.
That's what I thought. I had a client who did it, and when we were mapping out his nutrition, I think he's like, I think it's going to take me about 22 hours. So we got a 22-hour nutrition fueling plan broken down, which I think he beat that time too, which is great. But
Yeah. And then the cutoff is 30 hours, I believe. So
okay. Yeah. Yeah.
crazy.
And do you start, is it early in the morning or is it,
It starts at 5. So it starts
Okay.
really early.
Yeah.
So you get up the escarpment, which is basically the first climb out of Tahoe when the sun is rising. So it's like the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. But it starts very early. So your alarm is always for like 3:30, and you're like, oh no.
Yeah. Shoot.
But you don't even notice once you're going.
Yeah. With something like that, would you still do your overnight oats, or do you alter that in any way to get in more energy? Or
I definitely throw in more oats, but to be honest, I never can eat my whole breakfast before a race that early.
Yeah.
It's like the nerves plus how early it is. Like I'm really stoked if I get like half of it down, which I feel like I do a good enough job fueling, and I do a good enough job fueling the day before that I don't feel like that's a negative impact on me. But yeah, that's always been a challenge. I'm like, okay, come on, you can eat something.
Yeah.
So maybe this year I'll get to scarf the whole thing down.
Awesome. Yeah. So we're getting close to the end. I want to be mindful of your time. So we'll do our 2 truths and a lie reveal. So we had that you ski toured up the top of Mount Hood. You have a running dog that's cross-eyed, and you scored 1,000 points on your high school basketball team. And after you mentioned the dislocated shoulders, I wonder if that's from all the smashing all the hoops. So let us know, which one was the lie?
Yeah, the ski touring. I'm not a ski tourer, but I feel like it's very trendy in my sport, so I knew it was throw you. Yeah, I actually don't know how to ski, so.
Oh, nice. There you go. Yeah. So you did score 1,000 points. That's very impressive. That is. And so were the dislocated shoulders from bumping into people on the court? Or?
Yeah, I did one from playing. We would always go to Philly and play really, really good teams that were like basically recruits for like the best D1 schools across the nation. And I was just not that strong, but I was super tall. And so I would get paired up with these women who were just such ballers. And like one time, one just literally like went for a rebound with me so hard that it just popped it out completely. And it just was stuck out for like 4.5 hours because there was a snow blizzard and the ambulance got stuck. And like in Pennsylvania, the jurisdiction of the EMT is that they can't pop shoulders back in, and neither can paramedics. And so you have to take the ambulance to the hospital before they can put it back in. It was this whole thing.
You poor thing.
Yeah. And then the year before, it had been from like a similar scenario, but not quite as intense. It was just the other one. So I had a nice slew of back-to-back shoulders. Yeah, it was a bummer, but
oh man,
you know, I'm a much better runner than I ever was at basketball. I just didn't know it at the time. So
there you go.
Ended up being okay.
Yeah. Did you have to get any shoulder surgeries or anything? Or
I did. I got one on my left shoulder, and then I was going to get one on my right shoulder when I was still thinking of playing at school. But then because like having back-to-back injuries, it's like you get pulled your scholarship or any sort of funding really quickly once it's double injury.
Yeah.
And then it's kind of like a walk-on situation until you reestablish yourself. I decided to put the surgery off a year and be like, okay, I'll just get it after I get home from college after the first semester. But then I found running, and like running, you don't really, my shoulder never bothered me. And I just remembered how horrible the first one was. And so I just opted not to get it. And I think it gave me issues for like probably the next 6 years because it had gotten like this giant divot in it from being out for so long, but it doesn't really bother me anymore. There's just certain movements I can't do. Like I can't go be a spiker on the beach volleyball team, even though I'd love to. That's so fun. It's just not something I can do.
Yeah. Shoot. Yeah. We had a friend of ours. He initially dislocated it, I guess, pretty bad. And it got to the point where it just got so loose. Like when he would try and open the refrigerator door, it would just come out.
It's the worst pain in the world too. Yeah. Like, it makes me.
Oh man. That's brutal. The whole process that you went through, the medics and state lines and all that. That's madness.
I know. And then I was an EMT for 1.5 years as I was getting ready for med school. And I feel like I experienced those jurisdictions firsthand where a lot of like EMTs and paramedics have their hands tied a lot. And it's very interesting. And then it's even more interesting when you go to a different state, because then I moved to Colorado and I was able to learn to give IVs there. And I was able to do a lot as an EMT working in a hospital that I couldn't do in Pennsylvania. And so it was just very interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Okay. So where can people find you? You mentioned, I'd love for you to share your podcast and, you know, wherever else you want to share links to the people can find you, follow you, check out your published research soon, all that stuff.
Sure. Yeah, our podcast I work on with Corinne Malcolm and Hillary Allen is called Trust Society. That's on any of the platforms that you listen to podcasts. And I'm normally I don't do a ton of social media. You can find me easiest on Instagram, and it's just my first and last name, or it's at Run with Keel, which is something I created when I was like 19. It's kind of ghetto. It's like Run with Keel,
Okay.
with a D. And I've just never changed it because I think it's hilarious. So
Yeah.
People think it's Run Wild Keel.
Oh,
And I feel like I just let them think that because it's a lot more appropriate. But
perfect. Well, we definitely would love to have you back when you have your published literature results to go over. We'd love to dive into that with you. I'm sure the listeners would be intrigued by that. So we'll have to get you back on here in the future. So thank you again so much for joining us.
No problem. Yeah, thanks for having me.